So this book, Blueprint, The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society. When did you start this?
About 9 or 10 years ago. And I, at the time in my lab, we were doing research on friendship. We were doing research on why people have friends. It's not difficult to provide an account for why we have sex with each other. Most animals are, well, I don't know if it's most, but animals either reproduce sexually or asexually, and most animals, I'm trying to remember now what the relative proportion is. Anyway, I'm going to say most. Most animals reproduce sexually, and it's not hard to provide an account for how, for why sex originated, why we reproduce sexually. It's not hard to provide an account for why we are choosy in our mates or why we are careful in who we have sex with. But human beings don't just mate with each other, we befriend each other. We form long-term, non-reproductive unions to other individuals to whom we're not related. Why? That's very rare in the animal kingdom. Very few creatures do this. We do it, certain other primates, elephants, certain whales, and that's mostly it. So the question is, why? So I became very interested in my lab in trying to understand the deep origins of friendship. Why would natural selection have equipped us with this capacity? And that set the stage then for exploring all kinds of other things in our lives, like why we love each other, for example. Why do we when we have sex with a person, we tend to become attached to them. We develop emotional sentiment about them. That's not an essential to having sex, yet we do that. And then I became interested in other kinds of good things, like not just love and friendship, but cooperation and teaching. Teaching is another crazy thing. We take it for granted that we teach each other. But think about this. Most animals are able to learn. So a little fish in the ocean learns that if it swims to the light, it finds more food there. So the fish then learns to be tropic, to move towards the light. And that's individual learning. Some animals develop what's called social learning. Social learning is really efficient. So if I put my hand in the fire, I learn that I burned myself, I pull my hand out, I've learned something. I paid a price and I learned something. I could observe you putting your hand in the fire. You pay all the price, but I gain most of the knowledge. It's almost as good. I learned, you shouldn't put your hand in the fire. I saw that Joe put his hand in the fire. So social learning is super efficient, learning from others. But we take it to an even further level. We don't just passively observe other animals of our own species and learn from them. We teach each other. That is very rare in the animal kingdom, where one animal sets out to teach another animal something. So the book is about the evolutionary origins of a good society. It's also a kind of response, a kind of pushback to a long tradition in the sciences of attention to the bad parts of our nature. Scientists, in my view, have for too long been looking at the origins of murder and tribalism and selfishness and mendacity. But I think the bright side has been denied the attention it deserves, because we have also evolved to love and to befriend each other and to be kind to each other and to cooperate and to teach each other and all these good things. And I'll shut up. And
please don't.
No. And here's the thing. Here's the sort of one way to think about this. This must have been the case that the benefits of a connected life outweighed the costs. We would not be living socially if my exposure to you harmed me on net. In other words, if I came near you and you were violent to me, you killed me, or you gave me misinformation, you told me lies about the world, then my connection to you would ultimately harm me. I should be better off living as an isolated animal. So animals that come together to live socially, the benefits of that must outweigh the costs. Us living as a group. So all this attention to the ways in which our interactions are bad, that we kill each other, that we steal from each other, that we lie to each other, that we have tribalism and all of these traits, which we do. Every century is replete with horrors. I'm not like Pangloss. I don't think Pollyanna, everything's great. That's not me. But what is me is a kind of optimistic focus on the good parts of human nature and the recognition that those good parts must in toto overwhelm the bad parts.
Well, they certainly have to. There's so many human beings. I mean, it's
Yes.
obvious that this is working.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, I mean,
Yes.
we have propagated. We're everywhere. We're on every
Yes.
single patch of land that's occupiable.
In fact, you're exactly right. The argument, and that's discussed in the book, the way we have achieved the kind of social conquest of the earth, the way our species has spread out to occupy every niche, which is also very rare. Most animals live in one. Grizzlies live in this part of the world. They don't live in Amazonia, and polar bears live in this part of the world. They don't live in Arizona, etc. But our species lives everywhere. And the way we have come to be able to do that is by the capacity to have culture, to teach and learn from each other, to accumulate knowledge. So in the book, I talk about lots of this famous set of stories called the Lost European Explorer Files, about how European explorers are lost, they lose their supplies, they wind up dying, and but they're in an environment in which other people thrive and survive because they have learned how to live there. So we've spread out around the world. And then there's a chapter in the book at the beginning about shipwrecks. So I have this. Should I go on?
Sure, please.
Yeah. So I have this. So what I'd like to do is what I try to set out to do in the beginning of the book is I say, look, it's clear that our genes shape the structure and function of our bodies. It is increasingly clear that our genes also shape the structure and function of our minds, our behaviors, whether you're risk averse, how intelligent you are, whether you have wanderlust. These properties are properties that depend in part on your genes. But it's also clear to me, and that's what the book argues, is that our genes shape not just the structure and function of our bodies, not just the structure and function of our minds, but also the structure and function of our societies. And to really prove that, what we would need is something known as the forbidden experiment. And the forbidden experiment is an experiment in which we took a group of babies who had never been taught anything, who were acultural, had no culture, and stranded them on an island and left them on their own to see what kind of society they would make when they grew up. How would they organize themselves socially? Is there kind of an innate society that human beings are pre-wired to make in an essence? Now, obviously, that's unethical and cruel, but actually, monarchs for thousands of years have contemplated this experiment. So Herodotus writes about how one of the ancient Egyptian pharaohs wanted to know what kind of language what was a natural language we had in us that we would speak if we were not taught a language. So this pharaoh, it is said, took two babies and gave them to a mute shepherd to raise to see how did the children speak when they grew up. And Emperor Akbar attempted this. There was a couple of European kings that attempted this. Obviously, we can't actually do this. So what I do in the book is I look at a series of other approximations of that. And one chapter is devoted to looking at shipwrecks, groups of men typically, but sometimes men and women, who between 1500 and 1900, there were 9,000 shipwrecks. Many more thousands of ships were lost at sea. And in 20 of those cases, we found 20 cases where at least 19 people were stranded for at least 2 months. And here's a map of the here's one crew I can tell you about, but here's a map of the shipwrecks. Like these are all over the world where they occurred, and when they occurred, and how many people there were. And so then I got all the original accounts from the sailors, from the people on the wrecks, and all contemporary archaeological excavations of those wrecks where they had been excavated, and try to understand what kind of society did these isolated crews actually wind up making. And there were some amazing stories that were that I found in there.
So they stayed for at least 2 months. How many
Yes.
of them actually established a real civilization? How many of them
They
stuck
didn't.
forever?
No one was stuck forever. Most of those crews were eventually, in fact, all of those crews had at least one survivor, because if they had all died, then I wouldn't be able to know
Right,
about
you
them.
would never got the story.
But there's one famous case in which these sailors were stranded near Australia, I think somewhere in the Pacific, and they managed to catch a big petrel, one of those huge birds that, like a condor, and they put a little note in a little tiny bottle and they tied it to its feet. And this petrel flew thousands of miles and landed in Australia and was found with a note indicating where the stranded sailors were.
Whoa.
And a ship was sent to go find the men. And it got there, but they had all died. They were all gone. So they used this bird. So
Should have ate the bird.
Well, no, they didn't eat the bird. They
Should have.
No,
Maybe they'd still be alive.
I think if you had that choice, you would communicate rather than eat, Joe. I think.
Yes.
Yes.
For a little bit.
Well,
Then I
until the
started
very
eating those
end.
birds.
Yes. But
Did they starve to death? Did they know
we
what
don't know.
happened to them?
Nobody knows. But the point is that we have to have it. For me to be able to describe what happened, we needed at least one survivor. And often there were many cases where everyone survived. I mean, there was one pair of cases that was amazing to me. In 1846, in the South Auckland Islands, just north of Antarctica, south of New Zealand, the Grafton was wrecked on the southern part of the island. I can't remember how big the island was. It's in the book. Maybe, let's say, 90 miles long or something, or 20 miles long. I think it's 20 miles long. On the southern part of the island, 5 men are wrecked on the Grafton. And on the northern part of the island, the Inverco wrecks. 19 men are wrecked on the Inverco. All the Grafton crew survives. And both crews were on the island at the same time. They never encountered each other. They're struggling for survival. It's like an experiment, like who's going to win.
Right.
I'm tempted to say
Survivor.
fear factor. Yeah. and the question is who's going to survive and how and why. Everyone on the Grafton crew survives. And 16 of the 19 men on the Inverco crew die. And there's also cannibalism in that crew, so it's a very different outcome for various reasons. So anyway, so the point is that in the book, I start with a series of stories about how people come together to attempt to make new civilizations. I use the example of unintentional communities. With shipwrecks, I look then at intentional communities like communes and kibbutzes in Israel and 1970s communes in the United States, 19th century communes in the United States. Actually, going back to Roman times, there have always been groups of people who've said, society's fucked up. I'm going to go and we're going to make it again. We're going to start afresh. I look at settlements in Antarctica of scientists. I look at the Pitcairn, the mutiny on the Bounty. I look at the Shackleton expedition. Many, many cases of stranded, isolated groups of people trying to make a new social order. And then I also use data from experiments we do in my lab. We have this software where tens of thousands of people have come and played these games. We can create these temporary artificial societies of real people where people come and spend an hour or two, and we, with this godlike way, can engineer the society. We can have a lot of inequality or little inequality or various other features, and then we can observe what happens. And I look at all of that data, all those stories, and say, look, there is a deep and fundamental way that no matter what, human beings make a society. There are underlying fundamental principles about society which are as innate as the fact that you have 2 kidneys, most people, almost everyone, or your pancreas makes insulin. But
they're very different all throughout the world, right? I mean, there's totalitarian societies.
Yeah, no. So here's the point.
No?
Yeah. So here's the argument. You look around the world. And the example I give is that, yes, there's huge cultural variation around the world. Just like you said, totalitarian societies, people have different foods and they have different ways of dressing, and there's enormous cultural variation. And it's marvelous and interesting and obvious to anybody. But I think we're missing the forest from the trees. To me, this is like you and I are sitting on a plane and we look at a hill that's 300 feet and 900 feet, and we say those are very different hills. But actually, if we took a step back, we would see that we were on a plateau, and one was a mountain that was 10,300 feet, and another was a mountain that was 10,900 feet. And actually, there are these much more deep and fundamental plate tectonic forces that are creating these 2 mountains that are very similar, but we are just focused on the superficial top. So the argument in the book is that everywhere in the world, people have friendship. People love their partners. People cooperate. People teach each other. These are fundamental common principles shared by everyone, even though there's also a lot of variation.